Welcome everyone, and hello from Belfast, Northern Ireland on this International Men's Day. Thank you all for joining this evening's event, arranged by the team of the RCN Library and Archive Service in partnership with the History Forum. My name is Margaret Graham and I'm a member of the RCN History Forum, which is well supported by the Library and Archive Service, and it's well worth a browse through their website. Nursing history and profile has very much been enriched by their support. I chair a local nursing history network here in Belfast, which is very active, concentrating on recording nursing history from across the province. We have produced 2 books, one on nursing's experience of the Troubles and one on local nurses who served in World War I. I would encourage anyone to research the contribution past nurses have made to your locality, as well as reading about those known nationally or internationally. I'm really pleased to introduce this event on International Men's Day 2020, where we'll hear about Gary Jones's amazing life as an A&E nurse. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Gary.
Thank you, Margaret. Good evening, and thank you for joining me. I'm more used to standing in front of an audience than seeing you all through a computer screen, so let's hope all goes well. I'm going to be using PowerPoint, and the talk is based on the contents of my book, and it'll be in 2 parts. The first is how I got into nursing and briefly around my career, and then we'll take some questions and discussion. And then the second part is 3 stories, clinical stories from my days in A&E, and then how I briefly became involved in the BBC programme Casualty. If everything goes well, let's begin. Okay, so hopefully you should have the first slide up there now. And the talk links very well today with International Men's Day, as it demonstrates how I achieved entering a career, especially in the 1960s and early 70s, that is still even today seen by many as a female profession. And in fact, this year, the World Health Organization published a report on the state of the world nursing, and it records that globally, 9 out of 10 nurses are female. Now, the next slide, here we go. As you can see, I was born in 1953, and right from the very beginning when I went to school, I disliked school. I really was bored to tears. I dreaded having to stand up and recite the times table, and all I wanted to do was go home and play with my friends. I genuinely had no career prospects, and all I wanted to do was leave school at 15. Now, comparing that with when I joined the Red Cross in 64, age 11, I loved the Red Cross. I couldn't get enough of it. Every week I was ready to go back to learn all the information about first aid and nursing, etc. And for me, very much the Red Cross was so different to school, and I felt that the learning that I was getting there had some sort of purpose. But I was 14 when what I call my light bulb moment actually occurred, and I was sitting watching a programme that people of my age may well remember, Emergency Ward 10. And I remember it depicted a disaster, and nurses went out to the disaster scene to help. And suddenly I just thought, gosh, do you know, I want to work in a hospital. And on reflection, I think it was a combination of that programme, the Red Cross, and the fact that I'd recently been in hospital with an arm injury and spent a few days and had an operation in the hospital, that all sort of came together. So I got up and I walked out to the kitchen and I said to my mum, I want to work in a hospital. And she immediately replied, you want to be a nurse? Well, I laughed. I said, don't be silly. Men are not nurses. And she said, Yes, they are. You ask your careers teachers. Well, I tell you, the two teachers that dealt with careers in our school were all rugby players, and they used to talk about the boys being electricians, plumbers, all what I would call manly sort of careers. So the idea of talking to them about nursing was really concerned for me. But I plucked up the courage and I spoke to them about it, and their reaction was quite negative. And they basically didn't think that I was cut out to go into that sort of profession. Yet at the same time, I was doing so well in the Red Cross that I genuinely believed that I could probably do that. So if that wasn't bad enough, the Emergency Ward 10 programme that had originally encouraged me brought out their girls' annual. And then the career teachers said, well, the boys don't go to the hospital. So if you want to visit the hospital, you'll have to go with the girls. So I said, okay, that's what I'll do then. I'll go with the girls. And so I ended up going with the girls, and it was absolutely fabulous. I just loved it. I was hooked. And clearly the assistant matron that used to take us round, Miss Woolings, she obviously caught on, and she said to me, come and visit me at the weekend and we'll talk about how you can get into hospital and possibly into nursing. So I went along to see her that weekend, and she actually spoke to me about the cadet course. And she explained that I could work in the hospital and continue my education at the college. But she did emphasise that I had to stay on at school and get some CSEs. Well, that was just not in my psyche at all. But I thought, well, if I'm going to actually achieve it, I'll have to do it. So I spoke to the school and said, yes, I would stay on. And that's where Mrs. Beavis came into the whole equation, because she was my form teacher from September 1967. And I can't emphasize enough, she transformed me from that quiet, uninterested pupil into a confident, enthusiastic teenager. She was just unbelievable. First of all, she made me a monitor in the class, which even for me then was quite a thing. And then I had to represent the class at the school council. And before I knew where I was, she was having me reading the lesson in assembly. And I even gave the toast to the guests, including our headmaster, at a residential development course dinner. I became a prefect and I achieved a community prize. So for me, those 2 years, the scene was set for my career. The interviews for the cadet course were conducted first at the hospital by the matron, Miss Trimble, and then at the college. Matron's interview went fine. When I walked into the classroom at the technical college, the first words out of Miss Williams's mouth was, "Oh, you're a boy." And I said, "Well, yes. Were you not expecting a boy?" "Well," she said, we've never had a boy before." So with my newly found confidence, I said, "Well, I hope that you will be having me and I will be the first." And as you can see, Friday the 12th of September, I rode my bicycle through those gates, and my career began in healthcare and in nursing. Now, I'll quickly run through my clinical career. All the details are in the book that I'll be mentioning several times. And I just want to return, though, briefly to today being International Men's Day, because one of the very positive things about training and working at Allset was the number of men that were in nursing. And in fact, we had several of the wards run by men, charge nurses, and the director of nurse education was a man. Now, that compared with many general hospitals in the 60s and 70s was very much unusual, but it was tremendously different and positive. However, as you'll see, I became a night staff nurse, charge nurse. And when I was a night charge nurse, I thought, well, I better look at my career and see what I want to do. So I applied to the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy said to me, yes, you can come, but you'll be a Chief Petty Officer. Only females are officers. So out of that, I didn't pursue that. So then I thought, well, I'd go at the cruise companies. But cruise liners wanted me to have midwifery. And in those days, of course, men couldn't do midwifery. So both of those careers ideas were out the window. And today, of course, I could have done both. And in fact, a few years ago, the matron-in-chief of the Royal Navy was a man. So I continued on to stay as a night charge nurse, and then very much unplanned by me, but certainly obviously planned by Miss O'Neill, our senior nursing officer, I was suddenly whisked off of night duty to run the orthopaedic ward. And that in itself is an interesting story, but that's for another day as we must move on. So as you can see, I specialised in A&E, and that became my true career. I'll just pick up a couple of bits from there. Nursing officer 1983, the chief nursing officer of the district, Mr. Gonzalez, wanted to try an experiment. And instead of having just nursing officers for either day or night duty, he decided that he would quite like to experiment with a nursing officer having 24-hour responsibility for an area. And so he approached me and said, how do you fancy giving it a go? So I said, yeah, absolutely. So I became the nursing officer then. And in 1986, because of general management, Alsett Hospital and Basildon Hospital become one hospital with an 8-mile corridor, which was the A13. And so if you were the head of one service, you had to be the head of that service in the other hospitals. So for those period, I had the two A&E departments. Now, we also advertised that I'd mentioned a bit about my tour to Canada and America in 1980. I was lucky to obtain a Smith and Nephew Florence Nightingale Travel Scholarship. And the purpose was really to look at emergency nursing development, trauma care, and the development of paramedics. And I visited many departments and paramedic services across Canada and the US. But I'll just take one of the areas that I visited, the Maryland Institute for Emergency Medical Services Systems, better known as shock trauma. And what I've shown on this slide is Alsett A&E in 1980. You can see the entrance. All of our patients either walked in or came by ambulance. And the picture below shows our accident room, or nowadays it'd be called a trauma room. And you can see there was a reasonable amount of equipment there. But move over, and at the shock trauma unit in Maryland, over 60% of their patients arrived in the helicopter. And as you can see, their reception area and their trauma facilities were just perhaps slightly different to our accident room at Alsett. The same applied to our ambulance service versus the paramedics. There's a ambulance, Essex ambulance in 1980. And as you can see, if you look down, inside 2 stretchers, Entonox, oxygen, suction, splintage. But to be honest, the ambulance service in 1980 was still very much first aid with some additional equipment. Compare that with the USA, there's Medic 1 in Seattle, and you can see inside there, all those drawers, they held drugs, they held IV fluids, there was cardiac monitors, defibrillators. So a completely different service to what we had in the UK. So obviously that encouraged me, and I was so enthused when I got back that we developed nursing within our department at Alsett. And I say we because I couldn't have done it without the 100% support that I had from the consultant, Peter Ernst, and the nursing staff. And We done a whole load of things. We improved the trauma facilities. We introduced walk-in patient assessment and triage, nursing documentation. And over the next few years, we completely restructured the way we delivered care. And we developed a model of nursing for our department and a dependency tool. And our department became very much one of the leaders in emergency care. Now, in 1992, I left the NHS. It was really because I was unhappy with the way the NHS and our hospital was moving towards trust status. In my opinion, we were moving from a service to a business. And I had the opportunity to do some consultancy work with the regional health authority. And I genuinely thought that I would go back into another A&E department somewhere within about 6 months. But other work came forward, and before I knew where I was enjoying that work so much that I developed my consultancy, lecturing and expert witness services. And then that moved into mainly training and development. And I turned that into a limited company, and I sold it in 2017. Just pick up a bit about my other interests. My enthusiasm for A&E moved me to become involved with the RCN A&E Association, and I became its chair in 1987. And you can see from my RCN involvement that, like many other colleagues in nursing, once you get into the RCN, it sticks to you like glue. I also became involved with the development of paramedics, both in Essex and nationally, and I was instrumental in developing many of the early training packages. So this is my last slide of this part one, as it were. And really, to conclude, this B-class pupil that didn't have the academic ability to be a nurse and had to visit the hospital with the girls, I don't think I'd done too bad. And genuinely, if I could do it, so can anyone. I mean, from my point of view, Mark, the main thing is obviously to get into the schools and to get career teachers. And I'm sure the career people are probably better now than when I was approaching my two teachers. But it really is probably pushing it in the school's career side of things, but also looking at lots of publications that still seem to depict nurses as females, and they seem to have got better with depicting doctors as male and female, but certainly nurses tend to still be in a lot of cases. And I think I'm going to be talking about the BBC programme Casualty shortly, but I think that the fact that they've had Charlie as the boss for so long in Casualty, that definitely is a plus. And I think maybe if more programmes were like that, where they were showing men in nursing, that would be a possible plus as well. Well, at the present moment, obviously it's COVID, without any doubt at all. But I think if we go back last year, before COVID come, one of the big problems that they were having was the amount of what's called Trolleyweights, patients actually waiting in the department because there's inadequate beds, there's not enough beds in the hospital, because most of the hospitals are 100% occupancy. And it's really interesting because if I go back to the 80s and 90s, all of that started then. And then there was a period where so much was put into A&Es that Trolleyweights almost become a part of history. And then they've all returned again. But of course, this year, things have completely changed because COVID has taken over everything. And so A&Es have A&Es have had to be completely restructured in the way they function. So currently that is their big thing. But I think once COVID is over, we need to look at the whole question of how patients get into A&E, and especially the elderly, because the elderly and medical patients have always been on the increase for years. And so there needs to be much more provision in the hospitals, in the community, to relieve some of it. Minor injury units will, to a degree, relieve some of the minor injured patients. Do you know, even in the rough and tough stuff, there was a lot of compassion. You know, I think people always think of A&E as being all the excitement stuff, but the reality is a lot of the patients that come in, you know, I haven't got that story today, but I remember once standing with a husband, and his wife had got cancer of the throat, and her carotid artery was just going to about go. And I just had to sit there and watch this man, knowing that within minutes his wife was going to die. And you know, I felt I needed to give him as much attention as her. No, in fact, it was funny. As a cadet, I think I was a bit of a novelty. And so, particularly when I was working in general office for a couple of weeks, I used to have to go and collect the money from the canteens. There was one in outpatients and one in midwifery. And the ladies that used to run the canteens, they were absolutely amazed that a 16-year-old boy was going into nursing and so interested. So what should have taken me 5 or 10 minutes to collect this money, I used to get cake and cups of tea, and they used to want to know all about it. And I think, again, coming back to Allsit really was different to a lot of the general hospitals in that era, because men in nursing in Allsit was so normal. And I've never had any problems with patients. In fact, our orthopaedic ward used to be a mixed orthopaedic ward, not obviously patients mixed together, but when you were nursing, you looked after females as well as males. And when you were on nights, you know, in those days there was 2 students, and that was it. And so if I was one of the students and the other student had gone to lunch, if any of the ladies had have rung and they wanted a bedpan or whatever, I used to go along and I used to say to them, well, my colleague is at lunch at the moment, so you've really got 2 options. Either I can help you jump onto this bedpan, or you'll have to wait till she comes back from lunch. And none of them ever said anything other than help me jump onto a bedpan. There was absolutely no issues. I've never ever had that, which is really great. Okay, so this second part is very different to the first part, because I just wanted to tell a few stories. So there's 3 stories that I'm going to tell you about, and then how I got involved with the BBC Casualty. So the first one is the lady that came back to life. We had a call from ambulance control, and they said that they were bringing a young lady into the department. She was in cardiac arrest, and they'd brought her out of a lake. And when they arrived, they were still resuscitating her. And they said they thought also she'd taken some drugs and alcohol. And we carried on the resuscitation, and we were resuscitating for well over an hour. And throughout the whole procedure, the cardiac monitor was showing a complete straight line. And although the medical registrar was concerned that because she was probably hypothermic, we should continue until she was warm, we had a very domineering anaesthetist, and he dismissed that idea and said, look, we've been at it over an hour, and there's absolutely no life signs, no heart activity. So we should abandon the resuscitation. And so round about midday, the lady was declared dead. I moved her into a side room, and because it was winter, the heating was on in the side room. And for the life of me, I still don't know to this day why I put a blanket over her rather than normally putting a sheet. But I did, I put a blanket over her. And the family came and they said their goodbyes. And I sent the patient notes down to the coroner's officer. And by this time it was about 12:30. And I said to one of the sisters, Sister Mac, I said, look, I'm just going to nip out, grab something to eat, and then I'll come back and prepare the lady to go to the mortuary. So when I came back, as I was getting things ready, I heard a groan. And that's not that uncommon because gases often come away from the body. But when I looked at her, I thought, do you know, you don't look as pale as when I left you. And I thought to myself, although there was no breathing, she didn't look as dead as when I'd left her. And I just felt compelled to put my fingers on her carotid pulse. And I couldn't believe it. I felt the pulse pounding away under my fingers. Well, I came out of the room and I called Mac and I called the medical registrar and I said, just feel that carotid pulse. Tell me I'm absolutely balmy. Tell me I'm not feeling what I genuinely think I can feel. Well, of course, both of them felt the carotid pulse. So we started ventilating the lady. And when we put her on the cardiac monitor, it was showing a regular heartbeat. Well, I'll tell you, when the anaesthetist come down and I had to put a tube down to the trachea and put her on a ventilator, he was far less opinionated than when he'd left us earlier. I had to send the porter off to retrieve the notes from the coroner's officer. And because I didn't know quite how I was going to tell these relatives, I gave one of my colleagues, Miss Barnard, a ring. And she said, well, you know, do you want me to come and have a word with them? And I said, oh, yes, please. So she told them that we continuously monitor anybody that has died for a period. And while nobody normally comes back to life, this is amazing. And the relatives seemed to think this was some sort of miracle. And believe me, after admission, she went to intensive care, obviously. She made a full recovery. There was no brain damage. And I was so convinced that, you know, gosh, she could have easily have ended up in the mortuary. For several weeks afterwards, I wouldn't let anybody's leave the department. And in fact, nobody left until they were cold and stiff. But I had to give in the end because people kept reminding me that it was an A&E department and not a mortuary. And so we did eventually go back to normal practice. Now, before I move on from this slide, I want to reassure all of you that are thinking, oh my goodness, that could happen today. It probably couldn't, because emergency staff are far more aware now of the need to rewarm patients before deciding on death. And you have to remember that the resuscitation guidelines were not as available and not as comprehensive as they are now. The Resuscitation Council UK wasn't established until 1981. So there's clear guidance now for these sort of scenarios. And also we learned such a tremendous amount from the Zeebrugge ferry disaster in 1987, when lots of people were hypothermic and were in a situation very similar to this. And they've found if they resuscitate them for longer and warm them, their brain is not damaged, and people will come back to life from hypothermia. So that was an interesting and one-off, I have to say, experience for me. The next two stories I'm going to tell you is related to our mobile accident team, and you see a very young Gary Jones there. As there was no paramedics in the early 1980s, anybody that was trapped in a vehicle could die of blood loss and certainly would be in severe pain. So in some parts of the country, GPs and hospitals provided A&E on the scene. And that was something that we provided from Allset. So these are the two stories. This first one is a winter's day when we were asked to send a mobile team out to the A128. Now, the A128 is not too far from Allset Hospital. A car and a van had been in collision, and the driver of the car was trapped. So Peter Ernst, who was the consultant, he went out in his car, and I was to follow in an ambulance with all the other equipment. Now, normally they would always send us an emergency ambulance, but that day, the only thing they had available was similar to the picture on the lower left there. It was a transport ambulance. It had no blue lights, no sirens, and the driver only ever transported outpatients. They never drove in emergency situations. So this ambulance arrived, and I put the equipment and myself, and off we went. And the upper left photo shows you the country lane between Allset and the 128. And we sped down there in a snow blizzard, and I was convinced we were going to end up in a ditch. But by some miracle, we ended up on the 128, which is the picture on the upper right. And then the driver of this vehicle decided that she wanted to be an emergency ambulance driver. And we went whizzing along the road. 1 minute she was in the centre of the road, next minute she was on the other side of the road. And all we had was the flashing headlights and her honking on the horn. And I tell you, I've never been so terrified in my life. And by more luck than judgment, we arrived at this scene that you can see on the bottom right. Now, Peter had already got one intravenous drip going into the person's arm. I helped him deal with another one. Patient was unconscious, and I was having real difficulty maintaining this man's airway. So in the end, I climbed into the back of the car and was able to manage a better airway then. But unfortunately, he stopped breathing. And I remember Peter just jumping into the back of the car, and he was a very tall man, and he was like a circus contortionist, and he stretched over and he got a tube down into this man's trachea, and we were ventilating, but unfortunately, despite all our efforts, the man died. This second story, however, has a happy ending, and it's a summer's morning. I come on duty at 8 o'clock, and I was informed that the night sister and the casualty officer were out at the scene of a lorry crash where the driver was trapped. And they'd been there since 6 o'clock in the morning. And so the first thing I'd done was got the police to get some day staff to go out and bring the night staff back to the department. And they were saying it was going to be a lengthy job. Now, I'll just talk you through the slide so you can see the sort of situation we had. The top left-hand slide is the approach road from Tilbury Docks to the A13. And as you can see, there's a very sharp bend there. Go across to the right-hand side. Now, I can't honestly remember whether there was a crash barrier there at that time or not, but if there was, the lorry went through the crash barrier, because the lorry then ended up down the bank, similar to the photo on the lower right. You can see that lorry buried into all the trees, but unlike the back of that lorry, I've put another lorry. It's not the original lorry, as you can imagine, but it was that sort of lorry on the left-hand side that was down there, and the driver was trapped in the cab. So you can imagine climbing up and down that slope was no mean feat. And we were, by 10 o'clock, getting lots of information back saying that the patient was deteriorating. And so the clinical assistant, who was like the deputy consultant, he said, well, I'll go out to the scene. So I said, well, I'll come with you. And so we got a police car to get us down there. And we went down that slippery slope and eventually was able to get into the cab. And by this time, the man was really getting bad. And so the clinical assistant decided to do what we call a cut down, which is actually slicing into the arms and finding veins and putting some big cannulas in, putting lots of fluid in. And with further analgesia, lots of fluid, it took till 12 o'clock midday before we got him out of that cab. But, you know, despite that ordeal, the fact that we were able to provide so much care to him while he was still trapped, the care that he received in A&E, and then obviously on the ward, the man completely survived all of his injuries and went home happy. And we were very happy, obviously. I'm just going to use this slide for a minute, because when I tell lots of these stories, not only about the mobile accident team, but other things that I got myself involved in, some people have often remarked to me how dangerous some of these events were. And did I not put my safety at risk? And I say, yeah, well, that is true. But nothing, if anybody asks me this year, nothing like the risk nurses and others are taking through this year. As you know, many have lost their lives, and I just want to pay tribute now to all the healthcare staff that worked and are working so hard during this COVID pandemic. So let's move on to how we got involved with Casualty. In 1986, I was the public relations officer for the RCN's A&E Forum. And a few months before our annual conference, Casualty had been screened for the first time. And it was about a small group of nursing staff working in an A&E department. So not only did the title irritate some nurses, because Casualty officially was dropped in 1962 and became accident and emergency, but also some of the ways the practices were going on just weren't right. So our secretary, Ethel Buckles, she wrote to the producer, Garrett Morris, and said, you know, we're not happy with some of these things. And if you want to know what real A&E nurses are about, why don't you come and visit us at our conference? Well, not only did he come, he brought his writers, he brought his advisors, he went up on the stage, he faced 300 plus A&E nurses, and it went great. It was so positive, and he was so pleased that he promised us that it would definitely better reflect A&E in its proper way. He also invited us as honorary officers to go and visit the set, which in those days was at White City. And it was very flimsy because it used to be put up and down every week, because they didn't really believe that it was going to be a success. And parts of the walls were missing for cameras and that sort of thing. But when we walked around, it really was like walking in an A&E department. And as the show, as many of you will know, became such a success, the producer and the writers wanted to take it on to days as well and have it throughout the 24-hour period. And so the producer and the writer said to Peter Salt, who is still the nurse advisor to the programme today, how are we going to get Charlie to be a nurse manager, but also looking from a management point of view after the department 24 hours a day, and yet still look after patients? And he said, just go and see Gary at Allset, because he's got exactly the job that you want. And they came all down, the writers and everybody came to visit Allset, and I explained my nursing officer role. I explained and showed them my job description, and they spent some time watching me working in the department. So when the new series came out, there was Charlie basically reflecting my nursing officer role. And I got involved in one program, and they just said to me, can you give us some idea of something that we could do that's a bit of a disaster and we'll have everything? And I said, well, yeah, why don't we use hydrofluoric acid? Because that's really dangerous. And so they actually created a disaster with hydrofluoric acid. And I read through all the scripts and all that. But I have to say, although I enjoyed that, I never wanted to continue being involved with it. And the only thing now is that because of the book and because Peter Salt very kindly wrote a small piece at the back on the back cover for me, he's invited me to go and see where all the series takes place now. And I should have been there this year, but because of COVID, obviously, that hasn't occurred. But I will go and visit all their new sets, and it'll be interesting after all these years to see. So Celia asked me, what am I up to now? What is the future? Well, up until this year, my future was doing lots of cruises, but obviously this year that's been put on hold. I've finished my second book. It's linked to my memoirs. It's very much a different book than the one we're talking about tonight. It's history and early development of emergency nursing. But 25 years of that was what I call my time. So it's very much linked with my memories of that period. I've also been working on putting bits of the book into PowerPoint for talks, because a couple of people have asked me, would I go and speak to their Rotary Club or their Round Table Club or the Women's Institute? And so I thought, well, I'll develop that a bit more. So I really would be interested in going out and doing some of these talks, and it'll be a bit of mix and match, so people can decide what they'd like to know about. And that certainly is something, and maybe even, you never know, I might get even onto the cruise line as a speaker. So my last slide before we finish with some more questions and discussion, as you would expect, is my advert for the book. So those of you that perhaps haven't had the opportunity to purchase one or read one, they're available through Waterstones, Amazon and eBay. And if you want to have a look at the book or a part of it before you decide, the website there, Book to Look, you can have a look and see what it's like. And if you want to follow my story, my Facebook page, what I do is basically take different parts of the book and add lots of other bits that didn't get in the book, lots of photographs that didn't get into the book. And also, obviously, I'll keep you up to date about the second book. And if anybody wants me to come and give talks when COVID is over and we're back to normal life, then just feel free to email me. Well, it's interesting because in my time, a student who qualified then had to spend a period of time either on the wards or in other areas of the hospital before they could go down to A&E. But I know now lots of A&E departments take student nurses once they're qualified. And my advice is, when you're down there, if A&E obviously is a part of your work when you're doing your I keep saying training, I shouldn't get out of that habit, but you'll know what I mean. Really show interest, because if that's what you're really interested in, I know several nurse managers that have said to me, if students are really keen when they're there, we take note of that and we will always take them back and take them from brand new. So show interest, speak to the nurse manager of the A&E, and you're likely to be able to get in it. Now, with regard to paramedics, obviously it's very similar now to going into nursing. So rather than in the old days when you used to have to go into the ambulance service and then do a couple of years on the ambulances, you can now go into university and become a paramedic through the university system. Well, as I've said in the talk, really, I suppose it had to have been the Red Cross, and that would have been the cadet officer, Mrs. Longley, because she was always so enthusiastic about us doing well. So she was very much. My mum, obviously, for suggesting the idea that men were even nurses, because I genuinely had no idea when I walked out to the kitchen and said to her I wanted to go into hospital. And so it has to be some of the early people, like my mum, like Mrs. Longley, like Miss Woolings at the hospital, Mrs. Beavis. But then if I go into my years as a student, there was a number of people that were very influential. And one of the people that undoubtedly decided what I was going to do, mainly in all of my career, I think, until she retired, was Miss O'Neill, who was the senior nursing officer, because she seemed to somehow be able to manipulate my career without me even knowing it. In the book, I talk about when I came back from Moorfields and I wanted to go back to Alsett. And she said to me, well, I'll take you back, but you'll have to go on nights. And I said, well, I don't really want to go on nights. And she said, you'll either go on nights or you won't come back. So I said, oh, I said, well, do you think I could go in A&E on nights? And she said, well, yes. And her parting words that when I had that interview was, you either sink or swim on nights, and I expect you to swim. And that was it. So lots of people, but they're just some of many. And I'm sorry if I've left people out. I mean, if Tom Bolger's sitting listening, when I went to try and sort out my consultancy and my lecturing side, I went and had a chat with Tom, and he gave me lots of advice of how to go. So many people involved as we went through. Yeah, unfortunately, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things I've written in this second book is nobody has ever been able to define what emergency is. And so consequently, whether you've got a small cut that you could put a plaster on yourself, you will go to A&E. Whether you're in cardiac arrest, you'll go to A&E. There is no clear identification. So yes, a number of people should go to their GP. We've tried minor injury units, we've tried walk-in centres. I was very much involved in the early days of the telephone direct. You're having trouble with your cat, aren't you? But I think at the end of the day, you've either got to accept that you set up a service in a hospital or somewhere where anybody can go, or you have such restrictions that then some people may actually fall through the cracks. And so it is difficult. And all throughout my career, right from when I first started in A&E, it has always been, should people go to their GP, shouldn't? And I think it's about just continuously looking at the service. I know some hospitals have created what they call emergency villages, where they've got GP services, minor injury services, and then they've got the full-blown emergency service. I don't think I've got an answer. I think if I had, maybe I'd become a number 10 advisor and get paid lots of money. No, I'm not, I'm afraid. I've never tweeted and I'm not sure. I tried Instagram, but I haven't got on very well with that. Probably your best bet is Facebook, because I quite enjoy the Facebook page and keeping up to date on that. So that would be, if somebody can convince me about Twitter, maybe one day.
It's a pity we can't all do a round of applause. That was fascinating talk, Gary. You're a real trailblazer, both for inspiring men into the profession and also for all the work that you've done around trauma and so many different facets to career. I always think that's what's so good about nursing. There's so many career choices that you can go through. And again, I'd just like to echo your support for all the nurses who are still working at the moment and working through this pandemic of COVID. It's certainly, I don't envy anybody who's working and having to work all the hours at the moment in the health service and doing their bit so much. And I just hope that a lot of you who are still doing there at some stage will write down your memories or get them recorded. Thanks to everybody who's listened in. There's been a lot there and a lot of chat.